The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Psychology of Grit in a Residential Academic Context. I would say good morning, or it's new time here in Eastern time, so I think it's maybe morning in some places, afternoon, and evening in some others. So in any case, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lori Sabata. I will be serving as your technical producer for the broadcast today. So as my first official duty as a technical producer, I'd like to make sure that everyone can hear my voice and can see the screen. So you should be hearing me talking, and you should be seeing the screen with the webinar title on it. That has been prepared by our presenter today. If you can say yes to both of those things, if you could just go to your control panel, you'll find something there that looks like a little raised hand. It's like a little cartoon hand. If you wouldn't mind clicking on that, that lets me know that all is well on your end. And I'm seeing raised hands, so that looks good. Thank you so much for doing that. So with that done, I wanted to mention that also online and presenting with me today is Justin Reynolds. I'll be turning it over to Justin, and then Justin will turn it over to our presenter in just a few minutes, but I'm going to take a little bit of time just to go through some sort of housekeeping items. So I wanted to mention that we're, for the flow of the presentation, so we're going to have about maybe some presentation time to go through the slides and the content that Sean has prepared for us today. And after that time, we will have time for questions and discussion. So I would like you to take also a look at your control panel. There's a box there where you can type in questions. So we have the audience kind of on a listen-only mode today, since we do have about 30 sites joining us today, so we have a nice size audience today. So you'll be using that question box to type in any questions that you have during the presentation. So, and I would like to encourage you to be thinking during the presentation of any questions that you may have. I think that our presenter is going to, at certain points, maybe sort of pause and kind of throw out maybe some open-ended questions, and that would be a great time to go ahead and type your questions then, or your answers, into that box, and then we'll take some time towards the end to sort of go over that. And we'll take some time at the end to address your questions. So I'd also like to mention too, if you're having any technical issues where suddenly you can't hear the presenters, or the slides seem like they're not advancing, you can reach me using the, again, on your question box. You can find me on there, and you can send a quick message to me and let me know that you're having some issues, and I'll attempt to assist you. I do want to mention also that we will be recording this webinar, so if you have any friends or colleagues who may have missed the presentation today, we'll be sending out a link with the recording, and they'll be able to view it using that link. So I know we have a lot to get through this afternoon. I'm going to turn it over to Justin. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Lori. Just a little spiel from me. Today's webinar is based on a study funded by the association in October of 2017. The funded research grant program began in 2015 and is sponsored by the ACUOI Foundation and bedloth.com. Grants are available to all levels of researchers, and awards of up to $7,000 are available. The next round of applications will be accepted this March. If you'd like more information about the funded research grant program, you can email research@acuo-i.org. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sean to share more about the research project. Sean?
Lovely. Warm greetings, everybody, all the way from Cape Town, South Africa, where the sun is just setting over the mountain. Firstly, let me say thank you very much to Lori and Justin for the introduction, and also for facilitating this webinar tonight. Before we begin, also just to say a very special thanks to ACUOI themselves for really enabling these wonderful spaces for us. So very excited to be here with all of you. We're just going to dive right in. So the title of the presentation is Grit in Academic Performance in a South African University Residence Context. And as Lori and Justin have highlighted, I'm going to be taking a slightly different approach to presenting today. We will get through the content of the presentation, but I'm going to be pausing at key moments within the presentation to pose some open-ended questions and uncomfortable silence or not, if you feel that you've got some perspective to share, I really want to encourage that. So we've got some nice engagement going. That being said, let's dive right in. So the impetus really for this research, what sparked the digging deep into this area of inquiry, was this initial question: what makes students succeed? What are the factors in a university context that enable students to flourish, to succeed, to perform? And it's a very amorphous question to ask. And before offering a research perspective and some data on that, I'd be quite curious to throw that question out to those listening. From your perspective as practitioners, as employees of a university of higher education, in your view, what do you think it is that makes students succeed in a higher education context? Just pause there for a moment just to see if there's any responses to that or any counter questions. As this is a first question I'm asking, just to get a signal from Laurie or from Justin, if there's any responses or any questions to that one in particular.
I haven't seen anything yet, Sean.
Okay, all right. Well, let's just keep that on the back burner. But that now really was the broader question. As we move into today, what we're hoping to convey is to provide an understanding into insights and research on the psychology of grit, and to give you a bit of a picture of the South African higher education landscape, and the accompanying tool that we used, which is the short grit scale. And we're pretty excited as well to share some of the current findings we found from the research on grit in the South African residence context, as well as some of the really important critical factors that really need to be pondered very deeply if we're going to build on this area of inquiry. And the part that I think is going to offer the most interesting sort of practical application is the future directions. What does it mean to take these findings and to build on them in practice in particular, so as to enhance the student experience? So the study itself sought to explore grits amongst resident students at the University of Cape Town. Originally, we had a very ambitious target. We wanted 1,000 students to participate in the study. We did, in fact, get close to 1,000 participants. However, only 543 students provided informed consent forms that were completed, and hence the study is really based on that number of 543. The study utilized the short grit scale, and we're going to be unpacking that in a moment. And that was really to allow us to investigate if there's a relationship between a student's level of grit and their academic performance, as well as some of their personal characteristics or demographics. And interestingly as well, some of the characteristics of the residence itself. We were curious to know how the relationship may unfold amongst these different factors. In addition to that quantitative approach, we also unpacked a qualitative method as well, whereby we were very interested to hear students' narratives about grit, to get them to share current and prospective grit experiences and possibilities within a residence context. So we're going to be delving into that as well. Let's first start with the definition of grit itself. So Duckworth in 2007 defined grit as passion and perseverance towards the attainment of long-term goals. Passion and perseverance towards the attainment of long-term goals. A two-part question there is, what do you think about that definition of grit? Do you think that encapsulates what grit is? And the second, perhaps more pertinent question is, thinking about the students that you work with, overtly, do you see them exhibiting grit? If so, in what kinds of ways? What's visibly noticeable about your students in the way that they may express grit? So if we link that to the actual context of higher education, there are some very interesting previous studies that have shown strong, significant relationships between grit and academic achievement. There was a study by Strayhorn which found very strong correlations between grit and academic performance amongst males attending a predominantly white institution. And that's quite relevant for us at the University of Cape Town, where we have undergone quite a consistent level of transformation with regards to access and participation within the university itself, that our student cohort has significantly shifted over time from what was a predominantly white institute, becoming far more inclusive and accessible. And then, of course, there is a lot of correlations between academic performance and grits, with some gender differences. So we'll be picking up on that piece of research which has been found previously. If you look in a South African context, we are facing an uphill battle, so to speak, in that we have more than 55% of our students who will never graduate. In other words, at some point in their academic career, they will actually drop out from university. That we only have 25%, and this is based on statistics from 2013, we only have 25% of our students in contact universities that actually make it through within regulation or graduation time. And then there's a series of other statistics that you can see there through that bar graph. But really the point of sharing that is to illustrate that as far as continuation or success rates or throughputs and attrition is concerned, it is a deep area of attention that we're yet to really successfully tackle. And that was really part of the South African context, which motivated as well that very question at the beginning: what makes students succeed? If we could find greater, more informed strategies to that, maybe we could shift this bar graph over time. So grit within a South African higher education context, we really viewed this as an opportunity perhaps to develop a potential predictor of academic performance. That grit might give us clues as to ways in which to enhance the academic performance, the academic success rates of students. But also that it has never been tested in a South African context before formally. There's very strong studies which emanate from the West, from the States, from Europe, which really provide very promising opportunities for the implementation. Yet, to unquestionably apply those without first testing it with rigor to see within our context, where we have more than 11 official languages, is it an applicable approach? Is grit going to be understood in the way that it is being presented currently in the research? So it was also about taking a step back for a moment, and you'll see that as we move through the presentation. So yeah, just reiterating that rationale that there's very limited non-African higher education sample sizes in terms of current publishable studies. Throughput and retention does remain an issue, certainly globally and most definitely within our context. And our needs to identify student success strategies continues. We know that there are strong strategies that we can implement, but there's always room to find more, to discover more, to test and pilot more possibilities. And finally, that there is, at the moment, very limited research that interfaces the field of positive psychology with throughput and retention in a South African residence context specifically. So it was about trying to break new ground to see, can we fuse different areas? What kinds of findings and practices might we be able to discover and apply? I'm going to pause there. That was quite a bite-size a bit of information just to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Okay, and this is Lori. I just wanted to mention also as an alternative to using the question box, if you just wanted to ask a question, if you raise your hand on the control panel, I can unmute you and you can ask the question live as well. I had one person alert me that they weren't able to use the question box, so I don't know if there's a technical malfunction with that, but I just wanted to throw that out there as an alternative in case that feature is not functioning correctly.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Laurie. And hopefully now that will get sorted as we move along. Before I continue, Laurie, have any questions come through since?
I haven't seen any and no raised hands yet.
Okay, I'm going to take no news as good news, so I'm going to proceed. So now we're going to really focus on the current study. The research really was aiming to do three main things. Aiming to look at the relationship between grit levels and academic performance amongst students in residence here at the University of Cape Town. And let me just provide a bit of a picture there about the University of Cape Town. We're about 30,000 students at the university, and we're positioned just on literally on the side of a mountain, which is a stunning backdrop for the university itself. The university is about 180 years old. Very recently, over the last 25 years, as we've shifted away from an apartheid regime with racial segregation and moved into what's popularly known as a new South Africa, that has brought with it very deliberate transformation strategies as a way of redressing the inequalities of the past. So we're in a very important and a very interesting space at the university. Over the last 2 to 3 years, very important student movements that have emerged. Patriarchy must fall. It's a very national-wide one, Roads Must Fall, and that was really around the impact of colonialism on curriculum and on the university, as well as a series of other very important movements where marginalized voices were beginning to speak up about the impact of certain factors, yes, on their own academic and social well-being. So if anything, that reinforced the all-important need to have such a research question around continuation and success. So our next question is, what is the relationship between grit levels and factors of a residence? There's some very good research on this around size and shape of a residence, but we wanted to see if we to try and correlate these two areas, the psychological asset of grit with the physical parameters of a residence and its makeup. Would we see any links there? So this was new territory as well to explore. And then finally, the qualitative aspect is what are some of the narratives around students' actual experiences of grit for themselves and within their residence context, which may or may not be directly enabling or impeding their ability to be passionate and persevering towards the attainment of long-term goals, such as the attainment of a degree. What you should be seeing on your screens now is the short grit scale. And it's an 8-item Likert response questionnaire, which asks respondents to read each question and to rate then through the Likert options at the bottom as to how they identify with that particular statement. So, it ranges from question number 1, new ideas and projects sometimes distract me, through to setbacks don't discourage me, being obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time, being a hard worker, setting a goal but later choosing to pursue a different one, having difficulty maintaining focus, finishing whatever one begins, and being diligent. Now, the combination of your answers to each of these questions through the Likert approach transfers into a scale and a score, and you'll see that at the bottom. So there's a translation as to how you can score each of these questions from your respondents. And the maximum score you can get is a total of 5, which is viewed from Duckworth's perspective as extremely gritty. And then the minimum score you can get is 1, which is not at all gritty. Let me pause there again to see if there's any questions about that scale or what we've spoken about so far. Laurie, just checking in if there were any questions.
Yep, I haven't seen anything typed in. And again, just as a reminder, if you prefer, you can also, or you're unable to use the question box for some reason, you can also raise your hand on the control panel. I'll be watching that as well. I haven't seen anything come in yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Laurie. Okay, so let's move on. Just to describe briefly the methodology. So we use the quantitative data approach, correlational, to find any kinds of significant or non-significant relationships between the grit score and academic performance and the factors of the residents that we were seeking to test. And that really was to help us with any kind of meaningful relationships that we might be able to infer from what we were testing. I'm going to fly through these now because some of these really one can look at in their own time, but the sample itself, male-female dichotomy, it was 59% female that participated and 41% male. You look at the faculty breakdown, I'm not going to go through that, but you'll see there we also got some data on faculty aspects. And what you're seeing there in terms of that composition is quite reflective of the actual makeup of the entire resident system itself, whereby we have 6,500 students in our resident system in total. And there are certain percentage allocations per faculty. So that is fairly representative of also the faculty breakdown in our residences. And if we look at the gender of the residences that participated, we had 50% of the sample coming from co-ed residences where male and female share. We had 24% of the sample coming from strictly male residences and 26% of the respondents coming from female residences. So we have a mixture of different types of residences, buildings, and the way those are composited across our system. If you look at the year of study, it was primarily first years that did participate in the study, 57%, and then second years were the 34%. And it really significantly went down in terms of the year of study that participated in the actual short grit scale itself. We look as well then at the composition around racial demographics. You'll see there demographics pertaining to race, and this is also fairly representative of the composition of our resident system as well. So we've included this too, and there are some interesting findings on this as well that actually will need to be unpacked more. I'm just presenting that slide there for key information also. All right, so we're going to move straight into the results now. And this really is for interest's sake more than anything. At the beginning, we thought, let us test the actual efficacy of the scale. That, in other words, each question that is posed in the scale, does it actually correlate with other questions in the scale so as to test what it's seeking to test? Now, Duckworth in 2007 and further in 2009 inferred that yes, the short grit scale is a valid measure, that if you use it, it's consistent and it's reliable. We decided to just test that finding, and what we found, interestingly enough, was that one of the questions, question 2, was not altogether strongly correlated with the other questions around the passion and perseverance subscale parts. So question 2 is actually setbacks don't discourage me. That's the question, statement that's asked. But just highlighting that that one is on our radar in terms of whether it's that reliable in the way that it's currently phrased. It didn't quantitatively come up as a very strong correlation with the other questions that were mentioned. So if we go a little bit further into that, what we did is Duckworth has actually segmented the short grit scale and in fact the construct of grit into two areas that beyond the definition of grit as passion and perseverance towards the attainment of a long-term goal. Duckworth defines grit as involving two parts, a consistency of interest and a perseverance of effort, both of these combining towards the attainment of a long-term goal. So there are certain statements and questions that are associated with consistency of interest. You'll see there questions 1, 3, 5, and 6. Those are the questions that tap into the level of interest over time. And around perseverance of effort, questions 2, 4, 7, and 8 tap into the level of effort of somebody over the long term. And again, that's just to reiterate what we found, that certainly the consistency of interest and some statistical analysis there, we were able to verify or concur with what previous validation of the scale had demonstrated. But the subscale of perseverance of effort, again, just flagging that that might need to be re-examined or just retested, because we did not find the same level of sort of validation there. Moving to the findings themselves then, very pleased, and one gets always pleased when you find a significant result, but we were, let me take the emotion out of it, but we found a very significant relationship between students' academic performance and the level of grit. So you'll see there the p-value, but in other words, as students with higher levels of grit demonstrated significantly higher levels of academic performance. So now how did we actually determine that? So students had completed the short grit scale, and we took those in and we were able to get their scores, and then we were able over time to access their semester end and end of year semester results to correlate any kind of relationship between their GPA, which we use, their grade performance average across that particular year. And what we found was this sort of representation here, that in fact, the higher in grit score you had, the more likely you were to have a higher level of GPA. And that was sort of one of the main underpinning focus areas of the study. So to have that building block confirmed was a good start as we moved on further into the analysis of findings. So let me just pause there to see if there are any questions at this moment. Laurie, have any questions come through?
Haven't seen any come in.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to carry on. We looked at the level of grit that resident students had and the year of study to determine if there was a relationship. And you'll see there from the box plots that yes, in fact, as students went up in academic year, their grit score, their level of grit actually declined, not inclined, declined. So that the level of grit that students brought in first year was higher than their level of grit in second and third year. And that was a significant statistical finding as well. We move on to whether there was any correlation between the level of grit and the gender of a resident. We found here that there was not a significant relationship. In other words, whether it was a male designated res, female designated res, or co-ed designated res, that did not impact on the level of grit of that particular residence per se. So there was no significant finding there, all very similar kinds of grit levels. When we moved into the correlation between grit scores and gender, we did again find a significant relationship, that female students had significantly higher levels of grit as compared to males. And so that concurs with one or two studies in the past that have found gender differences in grit scores. And it's further food for thought for us as we try and unpack that over time in the future. If we look at grit score and size of a residence, because we have, residences as small as 31 students, all the way up to as large as 880 students. So it was important for us to see if there was any relationship here, and also with international findings on the impact of the size of your living and learning communities. You'll see here that there was no significant relationship between grit scores and the size of a residence. So there was not really anything to, at this stage with these findings, to unpack around that. This is just very briefly, I'm going to put this up, and we did some tests of association with academic performance. If I may, I'm not going to dive into this here, but for those interested, you're very welcome to have a look at that afterwards. This just gave us some additional analysis around grade performance average and some of those factors that we tested against grit as well, ranging from gender, size of arrays, year of study. And you'll see that the highlights in yellow are your significant relationships. We move into the qualitative experiences now. We did a series of semi-structured interviews with residence students. Those interviews were 30 to 60 minutes long. And the purpose of them was really to explore the experiences and views of grits, specifically in a residence academic context. We were very interested to know what are the higher education experiences of students in relation to grits, their journey of grit, their experience of maybe how that gets promoted, and what could be done. Now, at the time of sending this, there were 7 interviews with resident students, but in fact, we've based the analysis on 10 completed interviews. So I'm going to move into some of the themes that emerged from that. The first theme that emerged from the qualitative interviews consistently was this question: do residences promote a culture of grit? Do residences promote a culture of grit? And I'm going to throw that question out to those listening, and maybe to consider giving a response to that at the end of this presentation. But in terms of the overarching sentiment of the students interviewed, students said that unequivocally that residences do not promote a culture of grit, or certainly not actively. You'll see from this transcript that it really was about presenting that you're basically here to get a degree and to see, what comes there afterwards. It doesn't actually tell you some of the strategies or guide you as to some of the strategies consistently in terms of being gritty over time. It just sort of tells you to get your degree. So that was a very candid narrative here that was quite representative of this theme that came up. The second theme that was unpacked, that came up very strongly, is do residences positively reinforce grit? Again, it was around that question of, in the way that residences are currently configured at the University of Cape Town, are they positively reinforcing resident students to be persevering over the long term, to consistently have that interest over the long term? From a mission statement perspective, we want to promote lifelong learners, sure. But in practice, on the ground, within a residence, within a living and learning environment, what were students' experiences of their residences as a space that continually and positively reinforced them to perpetuate, to continue? And from this narrative, you'll see here that very interesting comment was around how in primary school you get awarded for persevering irrespective of the grade that you're getting. So even if you jump from 30 to 50%, you're reinforced for that. But in a university context and in a residence context, that does not happen. You're recognized and you're rewarded for academically excelling or performing at very high levels, but you're not necessarily reinforced for doing better than you did yesterday, or doing better than you did last week. So that kind of culture of grits in the institution, but also in the residences itself, was not directly experienced by the resident students. The next theme that emerged is this one. Can grit be taught? Can grit be learnt? And it's an interesting debate at a literature review level amongst different researchers who are debating whether you can actually teach grit or if it's something that's innate, sort of the nurture-nature debate. And the recent book released by Duckworth on grit sort of points towards the fact that, yes, it seems as though you can cultivate grit, that grit can be taught, and grit can be learned. But the question now is, how? How does that happen? And this was what was not very clear for resident students as to the teaching practices and strategies and the learning possibilities for how one would go about cultivating grit in others or acquiring grits in a resident space. You'll see here from this resident student's perspective that they felt like perseverance would be difficult to teach, especially in first year, sort of signaling that maybe it's not impossible, but it would be very difficult. And that is one really from a practitioner perspective that sparked our interest more into thinking around. We've got these significant findings between grit and academic performance, these gaps in the resident system that say there isn't a gritty culture in residences, there isn't ongoing processes to promote perseverance. And yet, the third question being, can we actually teach it in the end? Is it something that you can cultivate, say, in a residence context? Let me throw that question out to everybody and say, do you think that grit can be taught in a residence context? Again, let me pause there. Yes.
Sean, I do have a couple of questions, I think, from a little bit earlier. Is it okay to go ahead and read those out?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, the first question is, what do you make of the fact that gender was significant, but not gender of residence?
Right, would you like me to pick up on that one first?
Yes, please.
Right. It's a very interesting question. And from, I suppose you could say, experiences in the residence, if we take another objective set of data, and I'm thinking about this from a disciplinary perspective. We do have records that we keep of the number of disciplinary infringements across residences. And those records are really kept for readmission purposes year after year. And what we're finding is that there are more disciplinary infractions from male students as compared to female. And as typical, what can be typical with this age is the level of alcohol consumption involved. So it can often involve, behavior that is not appropriate while under the influence. That factor, combined with our senses possibly at this stage, particularly males questioning their identity in terms of what does it mean to be a male in a new South Africa that is transforming, I think is putting us in a very interesting position whereby for our male students, they are perhaps not as clear about the long-term objectives that they're trying to sort of attain, combined with some of those traditional normative behaviors around drinking, around masculinity, around sort of short-term goals, if we could put it like that. So that is a very preliminary interpretation that we have at this stage.
Okay, and then I have one other question. What do you think is behind the finding that as students progress, their grit declines? Is it apathy or academic burnout?
Thanks for that question. So why do we think possibly from the finding that grit declines over time, over the years? It's a very interesting one because the research shows that typically with age, grit increases, but that's in a non-university context. Our sense is that, yes, perhaps that it's academic burnout that's kicking in over the years, that it's a long haul from first year to fourth year. Now, your level of enthusiasm, your level of support structures, your level of orientation that's happening at first year is highly resourced. You have a strategic focus on the first year experience, an emphasis on good practices, on key strategies to succeed. So while you'd have the academic burnout aspect that happens as you're here year after year, there's also a decline in the number of resources and the amount of attention that's given to second and third and fourth year students over time. So there could be something there to unpack around how are we promoting consistency of interest in our second and third and fourth year students over time? How are we promoting perseverance in second and third year and fourth year students in the way that we do with our first years?
All right, I've got another question, if that's okay.
Of course.
The question is, how do we consider a more holistic picture of grit versus just academic?
So I'm going to try and see if I'm understanding that question. How do we understand a more holistic picture of grit rather than just academic? I'm going to be sneaky on this one and say I'm going to get to that, actually. I think it's an excellent question, and it's going to come up in the critical aspects as we move further down. So if I may, I'm just going to put that one on ice, and I will be picking up on that as we wrap up with the presentation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sean. That's all I have for now.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for those wonderful questions. Okay, so in terms of the conclusions from the study, is we did find a significant relationship between grit and academic performance and the subscales of grit and GPA. There were no relationships between the size of a residence, the gender of a residence, and grade performance average. And there was also no relationship between grit and the size of a residence, nor the gender of a residence one was residing in. Resident students did share that they did not experience the university or residences as a place or a site that cultivates grit directly. And consistency of interest, the subscale of grit, declines over time. And I'm just parking this as a question here that I put in the presentation is, what could residences do to cultivate or sustain a student's consistency of interest over time? And that really relates to the question that I'm going to be picking up on in just a moment. Reflecting then a bit more on the findings here is empirical support has been found for the view that grit may be more a situational rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. There's counter evidence to say that the relationship between grit and academic achievement is actually inconsistent. That it's not necessarily all significant findings all the way. And when you do relationship or statistical analysis between grit levels and specific course grades, there are very contradictory results that emerge. So I'm just painting a picture here that there's more to the story than simply a direct line of correlation between being gritty, being persevering, being interested over time, and voila, academic performance. We're finding some interesting counter evidence here. So there are very critical factors that really need to be considered, and it can really test one of our early assumptions. And that was, what is it that makes students succeed? We asked that question at the beginning, and we painted a bit of a picture around the South African context. And then we introduced the definition of grit as a way of positioning to say maybe grit is the panacea. Maybe it's the answer to, the problem of low dropout rates. Because the way that grit is defined is that passion and that perseverance towards long-term goals. But there's a hefty assumption in that. And the assumption is that we're assuming that students are viewing their degrees as the long-term goal. Now, what if they're not? What if then, and it comes to that question that was asked around the holistic picture, that we're being too isolating by trying to do a correlative study based purely on one's grit level, one's academic performance? What if there's more to that story than just meets the eye? And let's delve into that a bit more. So a lot of the studies have been correlated, and that's a big limitation of this approach. And very few studies have looked at the thinking behind individuals with higher levels of grit. What's actually going on in their mindsets as you move along. This particular point, the third point, is what are the longer term goals that students in university and in residence might be more fully committed to? Are they committed to other longer term goals other than their degree? And how would we begin to unpack that? And I think that that's part of the answer to that question around building a more holistic picture. That a student is not just their degree. They are multifaceted, and with differing ranges of long, medium, and short-term goals and values, which probably are impacted as well by their context, by their background, by their motivations for being at university. And it does require a deepening in the understanding if we are to progress with this area further. Now, a second point related to that is maybe students who are gritty, they might actually be subordinating other more highly prized longer term goals other than their degree so as to pursue the academic endeavor. And so that hasn't really been unpacked, and nor can that really be revealed in the short grit scale. So the limitation here really is around the lack of explanation of the kinds of complex processes that we are picking up and we know from research and we know from students' experiences are all parts of the academic journey and the residence journey. So trying to learn more about that is going to be very important. Let me pause here just to see if there's any questions.
I haven't had any additional questions come in, but we can watch for a minute to see if any do come in.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. Okay, so we are beginning to wrap up now, but just to reiterate some of the other limitations around very limited sample size. We used a sample from the University of Cape Town specifically, and it's difficult to transfer those findings to other universities just by itself. Self-report measure of the scale and the interpretive nature of qualitative research. These are some of the key limitations of the research that was delved into. If we look at some of the future directions there, I'm going to skim through these because I wanted to get into some of the practical recommendations. Is to consider replicating the study with a larger sample size, to do a retest, to engage with a larger qualitative subset of interviews, and maybe to consider a domain-specific version of the grit scale, which would drill down even more beyond the holistic picture into maybe an academic version of the grit scale, and perhaps to consider mapping the qualitative experiences of grits across a residence context in far greater detail. In other words, to get a sense of specific examples of sites and good practices where that consistency of interest, that perseverance is actually being cultivated or encouraged. What kinds of events, what kinds of processes are lending themselves to that? So we come to this question around what makes students succeed and can grit be taught and can grit be learned? And I'm going to be a bit brave here and unequivocally say, I think from other research that grit can be taught and grit can be learned. And I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface in the research and in practice as to how that can happen. Unfortunately, it's not shown here on the slides, but I'm going to just very briefly touch on three very interesting areas that we're in practice bringing into the residence space deliberately with a view towards trying to cultivate grit. And the first one is the WOOP strategy, W-O-O-P. WOOP stands for, W stands for wish, O stands for outcome, the other O stands for obstacle, and the P for plan. And this is a strategy based on work by Professor Ottingen, whereby rather than simply setting a goal then having a plan towards it, which is your conventional way, is have your students set goals, identify the benefits or the outcomes, of course, but then identify in advance the greatest obstacle to those particular academic wishes. And then a very important step is to get them to identify what their plan would be, not to attain the goal, but to overcome the obstacle. And what we've done last year, and again, we're doing actually right now as we speak, is across the resident system during orientation, this is featuring as a key first year experience practice, whereby we're actually equipping all first years with this reflective tool. They're actually practicing it now, where they're practicing to be the coach and the coachee, whereby they'll ask each of these questions to another first year. What is your academic wish for the year? What is the greatest outcome that you see from that academic wish? What is the greatest obstacle that you anticipate? What is the plan? And to overcome that obstacle. And our rationale here, based on that area of research, is that if you can equip students with tools at their own disposal to become reflective of what they can do to overcome their own kinds of obstacles in advance, maybe you can contribute a little bit more to their level of agency so that they don't become as derailed when they encounter challenges and difficulties, that they're able to think through, if this is to occur, this is my plan to overcome it. And we've got some very promising practitioner-based work that just came out in Talking Stick on this, in fact. So we believe that could be a very practical tool to bring into the resident sector. And in fact, we've now had it now for 18 months. A second tool that is quite important for us to pilot around this premise of whether grit can be taught or grit can be learned is Carol Dweck's model of the growth versus a fixed mindset. And what Carol Dweck speaks about is the idea that an individual's capacity to persevere and to be able to continue to go on despite obstacles can be based on whether they're cultivating and experiencing a growth versus a fixed mindset. And some of those characteristics really speak to dropout levels and perseverance in a residence context. So the difference between, say, a growth mindset and a fixed mindset from Dweck's research is, with a growth mindset, failure is viewed as an opportunity to grow, compared to a fixed mindset where failure is viewed as set and a reflection of one's abilities, which cannot change. Just another one is, for example, that with a growth mindset, my own effort and my attitude determines my attitude and my abilities. Whereas with a fixed mindset, is my potential is predetermined, it's limited. Now, if you think about that in a student context, when a student encounters difficulties, the difference possibly between a student that's going to get back up on the horse, so to speak, and a student that's really going to take the failure badly and internalize it, could be around a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, or the lens through which they're viewing their own capacity and their future capacity. And our argument or our link here is that we think there's a role to play for cultivating or promoting, at the very least, an awareness of some form of a growth mindset amongst our students in thinking and in practice. So this is a second recommendation that we're putting on the table. It is untested, let me put that as a disclaimer, but we think there's something to be said for perpetually promoting that. How that would happen in programming is yet to be seen, but we've got some interesting ideas on that. Let me move into a final one here, and that is a recommendation for the promotion of gritty groups, so to speak. While there was no correlation found between the size of a residence and grit levels, there's something to be said around the significant finding between one's grit level and one's GPA. So is there a way that small groups could be formed with students who have long-term goals, so that they can work together over time at key moments in the year, specifically on the long-term goals that they have, that they can hold each other accountable to each other's goals, to the milestones that they're setting, that they can share learnings, that they can share reflections on their challenges with being consistently interested, their challenges with consistently persevering, with applying even the whoop strategy on each other, so that there's a level of peer-to-peer engagement on grit with one another. That's where you're beginning to cultivate a gritty culture. And this was one of the signals that Duckworth spoke about, that being immersed in a gritty culture, in a space where you're in a community of people who are seeking to continually develop actively, deliberately. And yes, by default, residences are those spaces, but how do we up the game on that? How do we turn up the heat, so to speak? How do we enhance that space? And so the framework we are looking to bed down here through our mentoring program, and this is a recommendation, is Seligman's well-being and flourishing model, which is called the PERMA model of flourishing, whereby the research shows that the presence of positivity, engagement, relationships that are life-enhancing, meaning, and a sense of accomplishment, the experience of those 5 key elements, hence the acronym PERMA, positivity, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, more often than not in a person's experience in their environment, increases the likelihood that that person, that student, that community can flourish, can have experiences of well-being. So as principles of these gritty groups, as principles through our mentoring program that we are actively promoting now, is an awareness of asking our students and asking our residences, in what ways are you cultivating and experiencing positivity in your programs, in your processes? In what ways can you increase engagement in your residents, increase relationships that are life-enhancing between staff and students, between students? In what ways can meaning be cultivated more in your resident space, so that maybe students can reflect on a regular basis on why are they here? What does it mean to be here? And in what ways is a sense of accomplishment being promoted? Not just when one gets course grades or their degree at the end of a particular time interval, but in a regular basis. Students are able to experience those small and big wins far more regularly. So these are our, at this stage, we'll frame it, these are our conjectures, our recommendations, which we are looking to take forward in a practitioner-based way. And the premise here is that the growth mindset approach, the promotion of flourishing and well-being, and the application of the whoop strategy are perhaps key tools that already exist, that already have been researched, that may contribute towards cultivating residences as sites of grit, promoting that continuation. So we are very excited to be looking at that. And I'm going to pause there just to see if there's any questions.
I have no additional questions.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. So, yeah, we've come back to those questions. What makes students succeed? Can grit be taught? Can grit be learnt? And this is probably the most important one. How can residences play a greater role in promoting perseverance and consistency over time? And it's a question that we're just at the beginning stages of, to critique, to explore, to look at. But based on what we found, it's something that we want to lean into more specifically now in practice. Not so much in research, which of course we'll keep in play, but we want to see in practice now within residences, what are the direct impacts of some of these constructs in action. That really concludes the presentation. So I want to say thank you very much to ACUA and to the ACUA South Africa chapter that supported this, to the University of Cape Town, and to hand over to you, Laurie, for any questions that were received.
All right. Thank you so much, Sean, for spending time with us and sharing your research and your expertise on this topic. I really appreciate it. And also, big thank you to our listening audience for joining us today. Just one more reminder that we did record this webinar, so you'll be receiving a link to that recording. And be sure to share that with any of your colleagues who may have missed the presentation for today. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the webinar, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sean.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurie.